A nation can survive its fools, and even the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within.
They've been wrong about the wars, they've been wrong about jobs, they've been wrong about everything. The question is, are they stupid or do they have a plan? I actually think for the most part, they have a plan, but some are not too smart.
Welcome to the Horrible, Deplorable Show, the anti-globalist, America First program dedicated to dehoaxing the media and destroying the narrative. Here's your host, the founder and editor of the Daily Stir, Matt Wingard.
Welcome to the Horrible, Deplorable Show. My name is Matt Wingard, and with me, as always, is my good friend Doris. Hello, Doris.
Hello, Matt.
Want to welcome the Gab community and remind you that you can find this episode and previous episodes on many of your favorite apps for listening to podcasts like iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Pocket Cast. We upload it to YouTube, and you can find it in all these places by searching for The Horrible, Deplorable Show. We also play on the405media.com, weekdays at 11 a.m. and weekends at 5 p.m., and on powellmediainc.com, and you can find it on our website, thedailystir.com. I'm hoping you'll take a moment to write a review. Whichever device you're using to listen to the podcast, if you take a moment to write a review, that helps with the algorithms and will help increase the reach of the show, so I would really appreciate it if you would do that. So this last week, the Nunes memo came out, and a few days later, the Grassley memo. The left and the mainstream media's main approach to the Nunes memo was to try to run it down beforehand. What was interesting is that they made a bunch of claims that they then abandoned and went, again, according to Matt's 180-degree tactic theory. After the memo came out, they made the exact opposite arguments against the memo. So beforehand, they were saying, this is going to release a whole bunch of classified information, and it's filled with things that aren't true. Then once it came out, they said, how dare you attack the intelligence community and the law enforcement community, and we want our own memo to come out. Of course, after they just spent 2 weeks saying you shouldn't release a bunch of classified information, they wrote a memo that was like 3 times longer and that is now going through the process, may deliberately be designed to contain classified information so that it gets heavily redacted because they want to claim the Republicans are hiding something. But just a whole bunch of hoaxing around this. And when that didn't seem to work, and a lot of people read the memo and seemed to retain the basic idea behind it, that there was criminal activity going on at the highest levels of the FBI and the DOJ, the way they reacted to the Grassley memo, which backed it all up a few days later, was to try to ignore it. I mean, essentially, very little talking about it. No one on the left really attacked it. A lot of news outlets barely reported it because I think they realize they're losing on this issue, and they've tried basically every public relations tactic you can think of to come against it, and it's not working. I see that there's some polling out today that shows that about half the country basically understands the gist of the Nunes memo and believes it. And that is not good news for the Democrats. So what is clear from these memos is that the only Russian collusion that was going on was happening between the Hillary Rodham Clinton campaign, the Democrat National Committee, Fusion GPS, and then their Russian sources. Which makes this all, as I've said before, a classic case of projection, where the Democrats accuse Republicans of something that they are themselves actually guilty of. Now, there's a very smart reason for doing that, you see. If you are having an affair and you think it's going to come out in the next couple weeks, say in the middle of your campaign, then you start rumors and you accuse your opponent of having an affair before your information ever comes out. So then everybody's talking about that, and he's denying it and saying it's not true, and everybody's wondering, is it true? And then the information about your affair comes out, and you deny it, and everybody says, I wonder if it's true. And you see what you've done there? You've clouded the issue by making a lot of the voters think, well, maybe they're both having an affair, or I don't know which one's having an affair, or I don't get it, or a pox on all their houses. I mean, they must all just be cheating on their wives. It's a brilliant tactic. It's used mercilessly by the Democrats, and they've done it for a very long time. So they knew once Donald Trump got elected that all this work that they had done with the Russians to try to stop him, the assumption they'd made that he would never get elected, turned out to be false, and they had a lot of concerns about all of that coming out. Now imagine, and I've said this before, and I want you to do this as a thought experiment. Imagine that they had not done any of the Russian hoaxing, and that they'd simply gone quiet and on that and never said anything about him working with the Russians. And they'd simply just attacked him on issues, said that he was, all the other things they've done Trump derangement syndrome on, just assumed they were crazy about him. But they knew that there was this ticking time bomb that was going to come out where all of their collusion with the Russians and the dossier and everything was eventually going to get exposed. So they're attacking Trump for his tax cuts. They're attacking him for trying to repeal Obamacare. And then suddenly all this information comes out about how they tried to steal the election. That information, imagine that information coming out naked without any Russian collusion story against Trump. It would decimate the Democrat Party. Voters would understand that there isn't anything they wouldn't do to try to overthrow a democratically elected representative in this country, to undermine the basic fundamentals. They would go into the midterms extremely wounded and probably get wiped out. Now, they're not dummies. They understood that. So a year ago, when it was clear to the people behind the scenes, the strategists, that this information was probably unstoppable. Just too many people knew, too much information out there. Donald Trump and his people are going to take over the DOJ and the FBI when they come into power, and the State Department, and they're going to be able to expose all of this. What do? We can't make it disappear, but we can immediately now begin accusing Trump of all of the things we know we were guilty of. And we can spend months doing that because it'll probably be some period of time before they can get the real information out. So we'll have 6 months, 9 months, a year, some amount of time with our media friends where we'll have the field to ourselves, and we'll be out first accusing Donald Trump of working with the Russians. And we'll have planted that seed in people's minds and kicked up enough dust that when the information about us comes out, the average voter will, going back to my infidelity analogy, they'll be thinking, well, maybe they both worked with Russia, or I can't figure out, did he work with Russia? Did the Democrats work with Russia? Oh, the pox on all their houses. I mean, they're all dirty. They're all doing dirty tricks. I can't separate it. You see how they've essentially taken an issue that would have annihilated them, and they have neutralized it. Not by making it go away, and not by hiding it forever, but by muddying the waters ahead of time so that when the information came out, it just seemed like something everyone was doing.
Clever.
I ask you to think now, there's been a lot of attacks on Nixon over the years, and I was watching this Nixon Frost movie with a friend the other day, and I said to him afterwards, remember now that in most voters' minds, the Vietnam War is Nixon's war. If you ask the average voter, especially people that were born afterwards that have simply been exposed to the left-leaning history that gets put out there, who's the first president that comes to your mind when you think of the Vietnam War? Most people will say Richard Nixon. But remember the truth. The truth is that war had advisors put in by Eisenhower and Kennedy, but was greatly expanded and became a real war under Lyndon Baines Johnson. It was LBJ's war, fought for 4 years during his administration with many dead. And it was a war that Nixon inherited, promised to get us out of. A lot of people were angry about the methods that he took to try to get a peaceful settlement and how long he took. But ultimately, he fulfilled that promise during his presidency and ended the Vietnam War. And, it'd be one thing if people thought it was both their wars, although that's not even fair, because it's not fair to make it the war of a president who inherits a war that's ongoing, that's hot, that we're in the middle of, which he may or may not have agreed with, but he can't just end the next day when he comes into office. He has to find a political strategy for getting out of a war that he inherited. And yet, in a lot of voters' minds, it's Nixon's war and not LBJ's. Why? Simply because of who controls the liberal commanding heights in this country. And the fact that they can just continue to push and push and push on the idea that it's Nixon's war. All of which is to say that they've done a great job of muddying the waters so that now that all this information about what was going on at the DOJ and the FBI and now the State Department, with Sidney Blumenthal participating in gathering this information, we know for a fact, think about this, one of the facts that's indisputable, and by the way, was lied about and denied by the left and Democrats, but now no one disputes it, they don't even pretend it's not true, is that Steele dossier was paid for by the Hillary Clinton campaign and the DNC. They paid an organization, in this case they did it through a law firm, to pay Fusion GPS, which in turn contracted this MI6 agent to use his Russian sources to develop a dossier filled with scurrilous and false information about their opponent, about the Republican, the other party's opponent for president. They paid for that. No one denies that now. Now, in isolation, just that information is absolutely devastating. Remember when there was a big deal on the left in the 80s that George Bush had gone secretly to the Iranians during the 80 election and convinced them to hold on to the hostages until Reagan was sworn in? And then, of course, on the day he was sworn in, they released the hostages. Now, that story is a complete canard. It's not true. The vice presidential candidate, George Herbert Walker Bush, did not go and meet with the Iranians and convince them to hold on to the hostages until the last day. But the point is that that was a rumor the Democrats wanted people to believe because at that time, the idea that during election you would have sabotaged the other side like that and the American people and the sitting president was considered treasonous. And that's why they leveled that phony charge and they spread it around, and there's people to this day that still believe it. They paid for a dossier that used Russian sources to spread false rumors about the other party's presidential candidate, and no one's going to jail, and the press doesn't even harp on that. And it's because of the way they've been able, well, first of all, it's because they've got friends on the left who have, in the media, who have absolutely no intention of doing to this what they did to Nixon over Watergate or any comparable type of scandal. And by the way, these scandals are worse. And then after 50 years of lecturing us about Watergate, right, and the press constantly making the drumbeat for transparency and the fact that there's nothing that WikiLeaks could leak or that Chelsea Manning could leak or that Edward Snowden could leak that they wouldn't publish. They were actually making the argument before the Nunes memo came out that this was dangerous to release. These same people at the Washington Post and the New York Times and all the big media outlets who've always believed in transparency. If they can get their hands on any government document, they're going to print it, but not this one. So not only are they totally in the bag, but they have absolutely no intention of remaining ideologically consistent on this, on the issues of transparency, on scandal, on treason, none of it. They don't care. Proving once again, whether I rename it 360-degree politics or remain with the name 180-degree politics, it proves that there is no principle except the will to power on the left. They will shoot in any direction. They'll shoot westward on Monday, and on Monday evening they'll shoot eastward. It does not matter to them. There's no argument they won't make. I mean, look at this Adam Schiff guy. I mean, the things that he's willing to come out and say, and he has said over the last year, the rumors he's spread, the false statements, the innuendos he's made that have turned out to be false. He does it dutifully, like a good soldier, doesn't blink. And I had to listen the other day to Trey Gowdy on Martha McCallum's show on Fox News, it was basically kind of a exit interview, and he's retiring from Congress, and she was interviewing him about it. Now, first let me say that Trey Gowdy seems to me to be an extremely honorable person, and I'm sure he's a very nice guy. But I had to listen to him whine for about 10 minutes about why he's leaving politics. He said, I was a better prosecutor. I'm a better lawyer than I am a politician. And then he proceeded to talk about how Republicans picked on Joe Kennedy's State of the Union response and that they concentrated on whether or not he had enough chapstick on, and defended a bunch of Democrats who'd been attacked. And he defended some Republicans who'd been attacked, but he just lamented how nasty it all was and gave this lecture about how you behave matters. In the end, it all matters. And I just thought, he's just quintessentially the handkerchief Republican that I've been talking about. He would have Republicans act in a dignified manner, even though we all know the Democrats never will. He would have us unilaterally disarm because at least then we would know we were better people. I mean, he just laid it out there. I invite you to go online and listen to it. It's the perfect explanation from the Washington General's philosophy, the perfumed handkerchief Republicans. And I'll remind you that Trey Gowdy was a never-Trumper before the president got elected. It's this idea that if we have to get down in the mud, if we have to use the tactics that the Democrats use, if we have to fight like they do, then according to people like Trey Gowdy, and they'll just say it to your face, they'll admit it, I would rather lose because at least then we're better people. And I think, yeah, tell that to our grandchildren and great-grandchildren when the country's gone. Oh, well, but don't worry, kids. We fought with dignity. We always kept our heads high and we took the high road while they won every battle. But you see, while we live here in this little hovel, huddled around the fire in our cave, we have our dignity, kids. I just have no room for it. If you want to live a dignified life, I understand, that's great. It's not like I don't honor that. But politics is a dirty business. If you aren't willing to play according to the rules that your opponents are going to play by, because they will do anything to win, then step aside and let the Donald Trumps run. and go be a lawyer and go be a college professor and be a great husband and father. I'm not against all of that. It's all wonderful, and I absolutely believe it, but not in politics. If you're going to enter an arena, and I've said before that politics is war without weapons. If you're going to get involved in this war, you don't get to walk on the path, on the road, and whine about the guerrilla tactics the other side is using, shooting you from the trees, while you wear these nice bright red coats and die with dignity, and with your last breath say, well, at least we didn't participate in guerrilla warfare. I just have no use for it. None whatsoever. It's a loser's mindset, and it's a loser's strategy. I get it. It's an honorable viewpoint. You just don't belong in politics. Step aside. And it would be wonderful if the Democrats would play by some set of rules, because then we could be dignified. But in warfare, there is no nice war. You know, there's been this constant conversation for 500 years in the civilized West about how we engage in military battles that in an honorable fashion. It's all Barbra Streisand. If you have decided to go to war, it's an act of evil, okay? And you are going to participate in acts of evil in order to win that war. The kinds of things that we did in World War II would curl your toes. The whining that went on during Vietnam and has gone on in wars since then about the things that soldiers were caught doing or that were done, and people whine about Nixon's bombing of Cambodia. My God, the things that we did during World War II, bombing Dresden, firebombing Japanese cities that were all made of wood, the number of people that were incinerated in 24 hours. In many ways, the 2 bombs dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima were a mercy, because they brought that war to a close. And General Curtis LeMay was getting ready to do a lot more firebombing in Japan, and he would have killed far more people. Anyway, I could spend an hour just talking about the vicious mass killing that went on during World War II on all sides. But no one fighting World War II had any pretenses or any doubts about what the goal was, which was to win. And again, my philosophy about politics is war without weapons. And I'm underlying the phrase without weapons, which means you don't do any actual violence. But short of that, you don't unilaterally disarm in PR tactics or other forms of political warfare, while the other side is using those tactics to great success. That is just the lay of the land. I did not create this world. I live in it. If you want to win, you do what you have to do in politics to win. And if you're Trey Gowdy and you need to have a certain sense of decorum, great, wonderful, step aside. By the way, I don't give the rank-and-file FBI a pass on what we now know, which is that they were plotting and scheming against Trump, that they were working with Fusion GPS, that they deceived the FISA courts, although we don't know that the judge wasn't involved in this deception as well, winking and nodding all along the way. I don't absolve the FBI because I get it, everybody needs a paycheck and all of that stuff, but if silence is consent in this case, if you are concerned about the image of the FBI, then you as rank-and-file FBI members should be the ones at the forefront of condemning what went on at the DOJ and the FBI, and you should want these people prosecuted and cleared out. That's the way to restore your good name, not to attack the people who are bringing the truth out, or to criticize them, or to circle the wagons. And I get it, within law enforcement, this is, the thin blue line. There's this instinct to do that, but this is the same thing I would say to cops at in Austin, Texas, or some other random city in America. I didn't pick that one for any specific reason. The point is that if there is someone in your ranks who is committing crimes, you, more than anyone else, should want that person prosecuted and removed from the force. Because just their crimes alone are going to taint your department. But if you're all involved in covering up, or if you're all just silent and not willing to condemn it, and people see you sort of sitting there, then the taint doesn't go away even when the other person's removed. Same thing here. If you're an FBI agent in Phoenix or Tulsa or somewhere else, you may think you're a million miles removed from this, but you need to raise your voices. You are law enforcement officers, and you have a tremendous amount of power over people's lives, granted to you by the government. You should be even more vehement about people within your own ranks who are violating the law being held to account. And if you're not, that ultimately is what weakens your prestige in people's eyes. I actually believe that these bad actors at the FBI and DOJ, yes, they do a certain amount of damage to these organizations, but I actually believe the silence from the thousands of employees in these organizations is doing far more damage to them. Because what the average Joe sees is a lot of ho-hum from you people, which leads us to think, well, then you must think it's going on in other places, or you must be afraid that someone's going to accuse you of this. In other words, you're not as indignant about it as we are, and that is a troubling sign. And that's something that rank and file members of these departments should think about. I saw that Ann Coulter was, in her recent column, pointed out that her father, who is deceased, is a former FBI agent. She said he would be spinning in his grave over this. Now let's talk about the FISA aspect of this. So FISA's been around since the 70s, but it was really ramped up and given extraordinary powers after 9/11. And I'm old enough to remember the conversation over this. And there were a lot of concerns in Congress, especially among Republicans, about people's privacy and the kinds of powers, secret powers, that were being given to the government. And there were tremendous assurances made at the time about, don't worry, we've got lots of layers of checks and balances embedded in this, a lot of people looking over their shoulder, and then people looking over the people who are looking over the shoulder, and then there's somebody looking over the shoulder of the person looking over the shoulder of the person who's watching what's going on. Don't worry, we're all over this. It's been nearly 20 years now, and Cheryl Atkinson has suggested that there's actually been a lot of misuse of FISA over the years, and that the main reason for the hysterical reaction to the Nunes memo is not just concern about these particular misuses of FISA, but that this will open a can of worms in which the American people may find out about systemic abuses of the FISA warrant process. Now, I can remember actually attending an event in my local area in which this whole thing was debated, and the libertarians were making the argument that we shouldn't support it. And I remember thinking at the time that I agree with them, but that in the midst of war, just like with Lincoln suspending habeas corpus, there are certain things that I'm willing to tolerate. And you have to you have to go back to that time period in the aftermath of 9/11 and the lead up to the Iraq War and other things. There was a tremendous amount of concern about how much we didn't know and how penetrated we might be as a society. And I remember thinking at the time that this cannot last forever, that I'm willing to support this as a temporary measure, and it did have expiration dates on it. And I remember thinking that not only would I support it, but that I believe that ultimately it would have to be repealed, that it cannot stay forever, that it will eventually get abused. And I felt that it was the right policy at the time, but that it needed to be temporary. Of course, what's happened is that it hasn't been temporary. It's continued to be renewed. And they rushed through the 6-year extension of FISA in the weeks leading up to the Nunes memo. Both sides, Nancy Pelosi helped, Paul Ryan, all of the big leaders did it because they knew this scandal was coming and they wanted to get the reauthorization beforehand. I am now firmly in the camp that FISA has long since served its purpose.
There were a lot of Republicans that voted for it.
Absolutely. Whatever war footing we were on at the time, it's been too long now, and it needs to go. And I have no doubt that there have been tremendous abuses in the FISA system, and that needs to be exposed, and it needs to be used as a catalyst for bringing it to a close. It's long past time.
But what do you think the chances are?
Oh, I think it's gonna be a very difficult thing to repeal. But I think what's important is to not just continue to focus on this particular FISA abuse, but to do as Cheryl suggested, which is to pry open the process, encourage our elected representatives to question other FISA warrants and the FISA process. And if a few more scandals break, it could cripple this program. So we just need to keep the pressure on it.
But you see, the American public, the average person thinks, well, of course, this would only be used against people that are somehow reckless or a danger to our country. And they don't realize it could be used against an individual sitting in your home.
Well, look at what happened with Carter Page. So this whole FISA scandal in the Nunes memo is about a FISA warrant that was obtained on Carter Page and then renewed because the law requires it to be renewed every 90 days. So it was renewed 3 more times. So they went in front of a judge 4 times in total on this FISA warrant. And the original one relied heavily on this totally phony dossier. And it cited a Yahoo News article as backup to the dossier. Now, here's what we know. We know the dossier was false. We know that the FBI had been using Mr. Steele as a source, and that before they submitted this FISA warrant, they had fired him as a source because part of the agreement when you're an FBI informant is that you can't talk to the press. And they had found out that he had talked to the press, so they fired him. They didn't tell the FISA court that they'd fired the man who had supplied them with the dossier. Now, they're going to claim that they didn't know the Yahoo article was based on the dossier. There's two problems here. One is they fired the man because he was talking to the press. So it's a reasonable assumption, or at least it should be a concern, that the article you're using he may have been the source. But they didn't make that connection because they didn't want to make that connection. Second of all, what in the world is the FBI doing, let alone using a phony dossier? But they used a news article to get a FISA warrant. This tells you that the great standards that they've claimed the FISA court requires are Barbra Streisand. They went in and used a phony dossier in which they had not corroborated any of the sources. Remember, Steele was using unnamed Russian sources. So they're giving a dossier to the court that is one man's testimony based on talking to other unnamed sources in Russia who were themselves recounting conversations they'd had with other people. This was fourth-hand information, totally uncorroborated by the FBI, and the court signed off on a secret warrant based on that and a news article. A news article that is always filled with unnamed sources. You have no idea whether the reporter is Jason Blair and simply typed out a fantasy when they published that article. Citing a Yahoo News article is basically citing the trash in your garbage. You don't have any insight into how that newsroom is run. You don't know who their sources are. You don't know what their standards are. I'm not picking on Yahoo News. I wouldn't care if it was a Breitbart article. You don't go to a FISA court and say, hey, a bunch of reporters we don't know and who are using sources they say exist said X, Y, and Z, and now we'd like a FISA warrant to spy on this person. No judge should be accepting a news article as part of a submission, let alone a phony dossier. And I want to make the point again, not so much that it's phony, but that if you're a judge and you're given a piece of intelligence information that the FBI has obtained that is 4 degrees removed from the testimony. The FBI is telling you that an MI6 agent told them, that Russian sources he won't name told him, that other Russians that they won't name told them. That's what's in the dossier. And none of it is corroborated. And you as the judge are going to sign off on that. My point here is that there is clearly no standard. That whole submission is a farce, which means now, for the last 20 years, what we now know about the FISA court is that the FBI, the DOJ, the CIA, all these people have been able to go and get FISA warrants on anything. They could hand over a Snickers bar and they would be given a FISA warrant. They have no standards. It's all a lie. So that means the thousands and probably tens of thousands of people that they have spied on, American citizens, have had zero due process. And this whole secret process was a farce. Apparently, there were like 6 instances in which a FISA court wouldn't sign off on a FISA warrant, right? So you know that it was basically a blank check. And we now know the standard was ridiculous. So essentially they came, I'm not even sure the judges read these things. They probably just sign them.
Do you think it was just one FISA judge or different ones?
The list of judges that are on the FISA court, they rotate duty. So it may be that it was a different judge each time because there would have been a different judge sitting as the FISA judge at that moment. I don't know. It's an interesting question. Now that we see all sorts of judges out there stopping and blocking legal executive orders from the President of the United States, we know that the Democrats have stuffed the judiciary with all sorts of legislators, people who are fully willing to try to legislate from the bench and don't care a whit about the Constitution or separation of powers or any of that. So it's, if you've got these Democrat cronies in the DOJ and the FBI working against Trump, it's not a difficult assumption to worry that one of these judges is Democrat appointed and had no problem signing off on this Barbra Streisand. I do think it's also interesting that apparently of these handful, in the last 20 years, of these handful of FISA warrants that have been rejected by the FISA court, one of them was a FISA request in 2016 during the election that related to the Trump campaign. So there was a FISA warrant submitted. We know this because it's been leaked out. And a judge refused to sign off on the warrant that wanted to spy on someone in the Trump campaign. It was related to the Trump campaign or an employee or some hanger-on. In other words, it was it might have been an early attempt to get a FISA warrant on Carter Page. It might have been Papadopoulos. It might be someone we don't even know about yet. But what we do know is they came with a FISA request and it was an extremely rare rejection. Boy, don't you want to know the circumstances of that. Now that we know that they have no standard for the FISA warrant, how laughable did this application have to be that this judge recoiled from it and wouldn't sign it. I wonder if they brought them a hotel napkin with a scribbling on it, maybe like a doodle, and said, "Can we have a FISA warrant? Because one of the campaign people doodled this while the Russian ambassador sat 20 feet away having a coffee, and we think we need a FISA warrant." It could be that stupid. So there was an article the other day about a survey that came out of high school students, and I'm going to read you the 2 paragraphs before I go ballistic. It said, quote, "Far more U.S. teens than previously thought are transgender or identify themselves using other non-traditional gender terms, with many rejecting the idea that girl and boy are the only options, new research suggests." The study looked at students in 9th and 11th grade and estimated that nearly 3% are transgender or gender non-conforming, meaning they don't always identify as the sex they were assigned at birth. That includes kids who refer to themselves using neutral pronouns like them instead of he or she, end quote. Okay, so this article purports to be some big news that there's all these transgender or non-conforming kids out there. I actually think it's the opposite. Because one thing we know about teenagers is they're still trying to figure out their sexuality. There's some level of experimenting going on. There's some level of alienation going on in kids, frustration, depression. I think the 3% number actually shows you how low a phenomenon this whole thing is. Because I guarantee you that 80 to 90% of that 3% are kids that fall into a couple of camps. One is they're just gay, but they're having trouble accepting that or coming out or what have you. And so they go into one of these other categories to try to not deal with that. Or remember that now this has become it's got some kind of cachet. To be transgender, to be non-conforming is the new way to be a rebel and to be outside society. And if there's one thing we know about teenagers is that they will go goth or shave their head or pierce their nose, do something in order to say, F you to society and I'm not conforming. So you take all of that we know exists in the teenage years and they do a survey and it comes out at 3% that are willing to identify in this category. So in my mind, you have to lop off about 80 to 90% of that because in 10 years, most of those kids will not identify. They'll have gone to the term gay, or they'll have simply figured out whatever was going on in their crazy rebellious world, and they'll be on with their life and they'll be laughing about it or shaking their head about it like a lot of us do about our teenage years. Which means that 10 to 20% of that figure is more like 0.3%, 0.3%. That's the likely truth of this. As I've said before, there are more transgender people in television shows, being portrayed in television shows, than there are actual transgender people. I saw this week that it is the 18th anniversary of the whole Elian Gonzales brouhaha that happened down in Florida. For those of you who don't remember, this was the story of a mother who fled Cuba with her little boy. I'm not sure how old he was. I think he was like 4, 5, 6, somewhere around there. And in the course, this was back when people would come over in makeshift boats, and a lot of people would drown in this 70-mile journey to try to get to Florida. And she did drown, but her child survived and was rescued. And she had relatives in Florida who wanted to keep the kid. Here was the problem. The child had a father, a biological father. He and the mother and father were divorced, and he still lived in Cuba. And he wanted his son back. And so everybody started to take sides on this, but what mostly happened was that this became a struggle about being pro-communist or anti-communist. You were either for Fidel, because, of course, Fidel came out and took the side of the father, and the Cuban government wanted the child back. And a lot of people broke apart on this idea of whether or not this child should be returned to a communist regime, and that you were either pro or anti-communist based on how you felt on that. I took a totally different viewpoint. As somebody who's been wrung through the family court system and had to fight for years just to get normal visitation with my son, I immediately thought that the answer was that, of course, the child should be returned to his father. He has only one living biological parent. That parent loves him and was involved in his life back in Cuba, didn't know that the mother had taken off with him to flee for the United States, and wants his child back. And I thought it was indisputable what the answer was. This isn't about a communist government. We wouldn't go and steal children out of Cuba and take them away from their family because it's a communist regime and no child should be raised in communism. Families and family values are more important than ideology. And so while, yes, we lament that there are children being raised in communist countries, we don't go and kidnap them, and we don't deny parents' rights because they happen to be leftists or communists or what have you. So I firmly believe the child should be reunited with his father. And the Clinton folks had, the Clinton regime, they took, they had to basically use a SWAT team to go in there and get the kid, and they're condemned for that. And believe me, I'm no fan of the Clinton administration, and I got lots of complaints about it. But in my mind, that was a no-brainer. The father deserved to be reunited with his child. Nobody was claiming that he was a bad father, or that he beat the kid, or that anything nefarious was going on. It was the right decision, and I still believe that 18 years later. I saw a German politician who's part of the AfD party, which is condemned over there as being fascist and right-wing, but is growing because a lot of Germans don't like the massive influx of immigrants that have been pushed on them. But he was giving a speech, and he was talking about how it's a clash of civilization, and rightly pointing out the difference in Middle Eastern values, Muslim values, and what they're importing en masse into Germany. But I remember watching him and thinking, this is just 1 million immigrants, folks. I mean, you think it's a clash of civilizations at 1 million immigrants. Wait till 20 or 30 North Africans and Middle Easterners decide over the course of a month or two to just march into Europe. They've all got smartphones, and they can see the lifestyle that the Europeans have. This is what's bringing Latin Americans over the border into our country. People can see how we live, and they've just frankly decided, why should Americans be the only ones that get to live that way? I'm going there. This is why we have to build a wall. And the Europeans have no intention of doing that. And there is going to come a moment here when tens of millions of Africans and Middle Easterners are just going to decide, why should I live in a crappy place when I can simply walk to these giant welfare states and have a much better life paid for by the taxpayers there? And if they decide to do that in mass, coming in large boats and ships, big giant think of an armada of folks coming over the course of a couple of months, Europeans they're not ready for that. They don't have anywhere near the defensive capabilities or the kind of military they would need to stop that. It's coming. Looks like the Dems have surrendered on DACA. They have no intention of pushing that issue in the budget showdown that's going on. And Nancy Pelosi did some marathon filibuster in the House, but that was just for show. That's a political move to try to signal the DACA recipients that they still care about them while they're actually not going to try to shut down the government anymore or hold anyone hostage. They've given up on that because they've finally come around to an understanding of how bad the politics are for them on that. And then the other day I saw that General Kelly says that he doesn't believe that Trump will renew DACA when it expires in March. I wish I believed that. I still have concerns that the president is going to renew it, but nothing would make me happier than him not renewing that and the deportations beginning. I think that's the right decision. I think he's won on the politics on this, and I think these polls that show Americans want something done about DACA, it's all Barbra Streisand, folks. Look, you can do a poll and ask people, do you want the roads to be safer? Do you want there to be zero automobile fatalities? Do you want no one to die of cancer? Would you like all the DACA kids to be saved? And people will just say yes, yes, yes. Those all sound like good things. And can we get free lollipops too? What's really important in a poll is to ask people to prioritize. Here are 10 things. Please put them in the order that are most important to you. And that's when global warming just drops to the bottom, right? And that's when you know that even people who say, yeah, it's important and we ought to do something about it. Yeah, but would you like to pay higher taxes? Would you? No. And people immediately drop it to the bottom. And I guarantee you that if you actually asked people to prioritize on DACA, it would fall way away. So yeah, you can get 70% of the people to say Congress should do something about those poor DACA kids, but when you ask them, should they shut down the government? Should they give them welfare? Should American kids lose their place in college because the DACA kid has applied? Suddenly you're going to get different answers from the American public. So it's all been a hoax, and the president should let it expire and begin deporting people. But that brings us to this idea of what's going on with the budget. And unfortunately, I can't say it's really good news on this. The problem is that there's been this cap on the budget. What has happened politically between the two sides is that they have divided the budget into military spending and domestic spending. And that's aside from all the entitlement spending. Okay, so there's actually 3 pots. But the Democrats prefer more domestic spending generally, and the Republicans prefer more military spending. And the sort of truce that the two sides have come to over the last 5 to 10 years is that both sides of the budget will increase together. So they've put a cap on both sides, and the agreement is if you're going to raise military spending, then you have to raise domestic spending. And when the Democrats were in control, it was reversed. If the Democrats wanted to increase domestic spending, the Republicans were demanding military increases. And we've had these caps on that have prevented both from growing. And of course, now that with Republicans in control, the thing that they're lamenting and that they're crying about is that the military is woefully underfunded and that we need to increase military spending. Now, I addressed this in the last podcast, and I invite you to go back and listen to it, but there's just no amount of military spending that'll ever be enough. They want to push it from where it was in the 500 billions to the 700 billions, and I guarantee you that will not be enough, and there will very shortly there'll be an advocacy for $1 trillion in spending. There is just no amount of money that you can spend on the Defense Department that will ever be enough. And so because Republicans want desperately to increase military spending, the budget agreement that's going to be made here is to increase the domestic spending as well. So what is being sacrificed is the debt and the deficit. They're just blowing the deficit up, blowing the debt numbers up in order to get increased military spending. Now, the other choice they could have made is to move forward with budgets at the levels that they're at and not increase military spending any more than it already has been increased, and therefore not increase domestic spending as well. And that means you've got to do and address some real problems within military spending. You can take the $550 to $600 billion that they're spending and meet the needs of the soldiers and pay people appropriately and have good equipment. But you've got to make some decisions about the mission. Again, I talked about all of this. There's ways to reform the military so that that amount of spending actually is enough, but they have no intention of doing that. This is dangerous because that debt is a fiscal time bomb for the United States. And if and when the day comes that that time bomb explodes, it is extremely difficult, probably more appropriately labeled as impossible to unwind. The devastation that occurs when people lose faith in your credit is impossible to get back. Argentina lost it nearly 100 years ago, and they still have not gotten it back. You get into debt spirals that you just can't get out of. And no amount of military spending is worth that risk, and it should not be happening. I'm going to talk more about this in our military posture next week, but based on time constraints, I'm going to move on to the Trump scorecard that I promised last week. So at the 6-month point, I had graded him based on his promises. I went back and researched all of the major promises he made during the election and then graded him at the 6-month point on how well he'd done in keeping those promises. So this is the 1-year report card on these promises. On immigration, he promised to build the wall and make Mexico pay for it. Neither one has happened. He promised to end illegal immigration. That has not happened. He promised to deport 11 million. We are not on any kind of a pace to deport 11 million. We needed to deport at least 1 million people in 2017, and that didn't happen. I don't think that we even deported half of that. He promised to reform the H-1B visa program. Now, there's been a little bit of movement on that. They are asking for extra paperwork, which sort of is bureaucratically burdening the process and slowing down the number of H-1B visas that can be given out, but I think the jury's still out on that. Reduce and end Muslim migration. He's actually done a fair amount on that, so I'm going to give him a check mark on that. And the visa ban is in front of the Supreme Court, but they removed the injunction on it, which I think was a signal that they intend to side with the president on that, and so I'm going to give him a check mark on that. At the 6-month point, I'd given him a B, and I'm afraid the grade must remain a B, and I think I'm being generous on that. It is the most important issue. On ending bad trade deals, he promised to end TPP, and he did, so a check mark on that. He promised to reform NAFTA, and that has not happened. The WTO has not been addressed. South Korea, there's no new deal with them. He also talked about China as a currency manipulator and over issues around North Korea, which I've talked about in previous podcasts about how the Chinese may be manipulating that to keep him off of the currency manipulation issue, all of which is to say he has not addressed that issue. At the 6-month point on ending bad trade deals, I gave him a D, and I'm afraid the grade must remain a D. He doesn't get an F because he ended TPP. On foreign policy, No more wars, right? Well, so far, he's done okay on that. Finding a way to end our involvement in Afghanistan? That hasn't happened, and we've actually had a troop surge there. Defeating ISIS? Yes, that's his big check mark in this category. Absolutely. Making our allies pay more for their own defense, especially at NATO. There's been progress on that, some incremental, but nowhere near where it needs to be. Getting along with Russia. He said on the campaign, wouldn't it be great if we got along with Russia? Well, he's been hamstrung by the Congress. They almost unanimously passed those sanctions on Russia, so there was really nothing he could do about that. But I say he should just go full bull on and embrace Russia and drive the elites nuts. But he hasn't been willing to do that, and I don't think that Look, we know Russia's a bad actor. They're definitely supporting what's going on in North Korea. It's clear they've been supporting the Iranian regime. They're a bad actor. Of course, the Russia crap that happens here is just insane. I mean, I love how the left loves to harp on the fact that Russia interfered in our election, and they're meddling. You know who the biggest meddler in other countries' elections is?
Yes.
The United States of America. We've been overthrowing regimes and putting all sorts of pressure and funneling money to opposition groups or the candidates that we support in certain countries. We've been doing that for decades, and I'm not necessarily against it, but don't go around getting all upset because the Russians decide to participate in that as well. And it's like there are lots of countries that do that. I'm sure the Israelis do it as well. I'm really not concerned about that. Show me where actual vote tallies have been changed by a foreign government and I'll get alarmed. Otherwise, Mexico, their own people were advocating a vote against Donald Trump and encouraging Mexicans and former Mexican citizens in the United States to vote against him. So Mexico was far more involved in our election than the Russians. Okay, so that's all a canard and it's BS. All countries interfere in each other's elections. If you're going to define that in quotes as taking a side or encouraging one side over the other, that happens all the time. And we are the biggest actors in it. So if you're going to talk about Russia collusion and Russian interference and all that, I got no time for that because it's just bull. And besides, the Russians are looking out for their own interests. They're not trying to export international communism like they were during the Cold War. They're just acting in their own domestic interests. And so to the extent that they push around in Iran or North Korea or Europe or whatever, it's all just for their own economic, kleptocratic interests, which is basically, broadly defined, no different than what any other country does. And so I'm just not that concerned about it. You just need to be aware of it. Like I said, they're not a good actor, but they're not the biggest villain on the planet. That's ridiculous. Anyway, so he hasn't really done a good job of fixing the Russia problem. Renegotiating the Iran deal, well, he's signaled that he's not going to sign off on any more 6-month verifications, but really not a tremendous amount of progress on that. So it was a B- on foreign policy at the halfway point. Because of the defeat of ISIS, I'm going to move it up to a B. So some progress on that grade at the year-end point. Jobs. He said he would bring manufacturing back. There's been some progress on that. Keep companies from leaving. There's been some progress on that. Create more jobs and rising wages for low-income Americans and minorities. He went into, Michigan, and made that promise. I give him a check mark for that. We see wages are rising, and he has created jobs. So, on the jobs, I gave him a B at the 6-month point. I'm going to give him a B+ at this point. I think that is headed into the A territory this year. We'll see. Drain the swamp. Well, there was a lobbying ban on former White House employees, but he hired a lot of swamp creatures, including Elaine Chao and his NSA team. Some of them people have been ushered out since then, but he does hit hard, and I like that about him. There's a lot of executive positions that are just going unfilled on purpose. The president is essentially just downsizing without asking Congress. And the release, the memo, whole controversy, the Nunes memos, that could be a breakthrough in draining the swamp. I noticed that we had another person at the DOJ resign today. So this is good. There's progress being made in driving these weasels out. People need to be prosecuted, though, and disbarred. I think, though, the real long-term definition for me of draining the swamp is real estate values in D.C. As long as they're going up, then that means that city is thriving and the swamp is not being drained. And there's been very little progress on that. So I gave him a C at the 6-month point, and I'm afraid I'm going to give him a C- at this point, because as time goes on, we should be seeing more progress on that, not less or flat. Protecting Social Security and Medicare. I gave him an A at the 6-month point, and I give him an A now. Promised he would, and they've remained protected. Repeal and replace Obamacare. At the 6-month point, I gave him an A because it looked like they were very close to passing that. They did not, and therefore the grade now is a C. And the only reason it's not an F is because they did manage to slip the mandate repeal into the tax cut bill. So from an A to a C. Lock her up! He said he would prosecute Hillary Clinton. There's been some movement on this based on what's been coming out and the IG report that is expected, the Inspector General's report that's expected in March. But he said you'd be in jail, and she's not. So it was an F at the 6-month point. I'm going to give him a D+ on lock her up at this point, 1 year in. He promised on the Supreme Court he would nominate someone like Gorsuch, and he did. He got an A at the 6-month point. There have been no additional vacancies since then, so it remains an A. He said we would start winning again. I gave him an A at the 6-month point, and I'm going to maintain the A, because we are winning. I mean, he drives them absolutely batshit crazy and off kilter to the point where they cannot bring their A game, and they make lots of mistakes. And he's made them an easier opponent to defeat, which I find one of the many miraculous things that he's done. And with the economic numbers and the stock market and jobs and wages rising and defeating ISIS and driving the left crazy, I mean, it's win every day. I think, I'm usually putting something out on social media practically every day with the hashtag winning because of Trump and his administration. So definitely maintains the A on that. Overall, 1-year grade is a solid B. There's a lot more work to do. It's down slightly from the 6-month point. And again, there have actually been a few more accomplishments in the second 6 months, but things get weighted heavier in my mind. The more time he has to accomplish things, the higher my expectations go. I was lenient at the 6-month point because I believed he just needed a little bit more time with things like, say, the Obamacare repeal. So the longer the administration goes on, the less tolerant I am of a failure to make the grade. And so for that reason, it's a slight downgrade from the 6-month point. Doris and I went to the movie theaters, but we split and went to 2 different shows. She went to see The Greatest Showman, and I went to see Hostels. Doris, your thoughts on The Greatest Showman?
Well, I really enjoyed all the singing and dancing. It was like an old-time musical. Hugh Jackman is so talented, and the cast of characters was very likable, and they did a good job. I would give it a B, not the greatest movie, but good for a couple of hours of enjoyment.
Why only a B? What was wrong with it?
It just didn't have enough substance. I thought it could have told the story of P.T. Barnum better than it did.
All right, well, I'm going to get to Hostels in a minute, but Doris and I both saw Shape of Water. Doris and I left with entirely different viewpoints on this movie. Take a guess right now which one of us loved it and which one of us didn't. And you're probably right. Doris, what your thoughts on Shape of Water? Which we both, actually, here's something we both agree on. It's probably going to win Best Picture. Oh. And if it doesn't, the other movie will be 3 Billboards that I hated, and you all know that. But Doris, your thoughts on Shape of Water?
It was one of my favorite movies this year. The movie is about a lonely maid played by Sally Hawkins, and she's trapped in a life of silence because she's mute.
Right.
So she works in a government lab where she's exposed to a secret classified experiment. Her ardent longing for a connection leads to something weird and wonderful happening. Everything about this movie was done sublimely. Probably the reason it has received 13 Academy Award nominations. So my advice is don't miss The Shape of Water.
When you listen to Doris's description, this seems like a really great movie. Then they put it into the hands of a Mexican director who is a strong social justice warrior, Guillermo del Toro, and he proceeded to make another social justice warrior fest. In his casting choices and in the details of the story that Doris didn't give, everything is social justice warriors. So it's strong. First of all, there's at the core of this movie, bestiality, which is, exciting. There's a strong emphasis on toxic masculinity. All of the male characters in the movie are either bad, toxic masculinity males or gay. essentially they're portrayed in some way as not being fully masculine. There's a strong strain of anti-Americanism in the film. The movie takes place during the Cold War, and of course, it's got the usual tropes of the military bad and the generals are unfeeling and don't care and all of the rest. There's even a Russian spy in the movie who is one of the good guys. So it's just all so very predictable. Every single one of, this is a conglomeration of misfits in this movie. And all of the misfits are in the currently championed victim groups in our society. Matter of fact, I was actually shocked that there wasn't a transgender character in the movie. That was the one thing it was missing. So, while I would agree that Doris's description is quite nice, the actual execution of the movie is a complete assault on any value that you might hold. And, it just goes to my point about subtext matters, right? It's not just a movie. It takes these people 3 years to write and then film and then edit this movie. And they're artists, and artists want to use their talents to not only tell a story, but to change the world and to preach to us. And the really good ones usually try to tell a really great universal story and then subtly preach to us about how they want us to change or how we should think differently. And the not-so-good ones just hammer you over the head on it. Now, I'll admit, because it's all coming from the left, I'll admit that this movie is actually executed quite well. It's a beautiful-looking movie. Technically, it's done very well. But you are definitely having a bucket of social justice warriorism poured over your head the entire time. I would give it a B-. So I saw Maze Runner: The Death Cure, which is the final movie in this trilogy. These are all Hunger Game knockoffs, right? It's all teen dystopia movies, all originally based on a Japanese movie. But the Hunger Games trilogy is out and done. There was the Divergent trilogy, and that's out and done. And now the Maze Runner trilogy is out and done. There was another one one of these studios started called The Giver, but it was such an awful movie and such a box office failure that they never bothered to move forward with the rest of that monstrosity. I would say this about Maze Runner. As an overall trilogy, this is probably better than The Hunger Games. All of them basically lose a step after their first opening movie, but I really felt like The Hunger Games declined much faster in its total trilogy. And The Maze Runner got almost as good a start as The Hunger Games, and then just maintains better, doesn't fall off as much as The Hunger Games. So among all of these trilogies, I would actually say Maze Runner is the best. But the problem they all have, and I would say this of Divergent as well, is that they have a really great idea that's executed very well in the first movie, but then basically the mystery is solved in the first movie, or you understand essentially what's going on. And then the other two just become kind of Storm the Castle movies, where there's some kind of organization that's running this evil world and the kids have to band together to go through 1,000 obstacles to eventually ascend the mountain and topple the evil regime, right? And so it's all kind of a Dirty Dozen, Devil's Reject kinds of movie. And it's just not as interesting as the original movie. In The Hunger Games, the kids are in some kind of a death match with each other where only one can survive. And that's really interesting and compelling. And nothing that comes after that can really be as interesting. And in The Maze Runner, the kids wake up with amnesia in a maze they've got to find their way out of, and they don't know why they're there or what it's all about. And that's interesting and compelling. But then after after they escape, or some of them do, what happens after that is fairly predictable and not anywhere near as compelling. And Divergent is the same thing. There's this idea that the kids are all divided into 4 groups based on their personalities, and that's sort of intriguing, and you want to kind of understand how that all works. But then once the nefariousness of the whole thing has been revealed and it just becomes kind of them against the world, it kind of breaks down into the same basic plot structures that the others do. And so they all suffer from that. I would give the whole trilogy a B for Maze Runner. And the last one, obviously not as good, but entertaining. And lastly, Hostels, which I saw this week. Now, this is a movie I'm going to complain bitterly about because nothing makes me angrier than a movie that is nearly perfect and manages to botch it in the end. It's like watching, the Olympics are here now, and when we all get on pins and needles nervous when the girl in this is the Summer Olympics I'm thinking of, but I'm going to use this analogy anyway. When they come out to do their floor mat exercise in gymnastics, and they have to be out there for like a minute, and they do all these tumbles, and then if they put their feet in the corner and they're going to do that last run where they're going to do some triple, quadruple somersault, and they have to stick that landing. And even though they've done this great floor exercise for a minute and a half, you're nervous as heck because you know if they do some kind of hop or whatever, if they're not able to do it, then it's all blown. All the good work is blown, and they're not going to get a medal. That's how I feel about movies like Hostiles. This is a movie that takes place in 1892 in the frontier, and it's essentially about a frontier soldier played by Christian Bale. And he has to escort a dying Indian chief up north to Montana, from New Mexico up to Montana. And he's got a history with this guy. They've been at war with each other. The chief's been in prison for a long time. Wes Studi plays the chief. And then it's sort of this journey that unfolds and all the weird and unfortunate things that happen along the way. And I don't want to give away any more of the plot than that. It is so hard to do a Western today because there's so much political correctness that people from the left feel a need to impose on these plots, that the Indians are all good and the white guys are all bad, that there should be all this shame and regret about our Western expansion. There's all this feminism and sort of modern feminism that people want to push onto these stories that people in that time period wouldn't even know what you're talking about. And this movie is so brilliant for the first 2/3 because it is just an honest and accurate portrayal of that time period. The women, the men, the Indians, the whites, it's honest. There are no white hats and black hats. People are just acting the way they would have acted. And men are being men and women are being women. It is gritty and it is honest and it is compelling. And you are totally locked in to this movie about where is it going to go. And then, my dear listeners, in the third act, they completely fail to stick the landing. And one of the soldiers apologizes to the chief for the way the Indians have been treated, which is just something you write now that nobody in 1892, especially who'd been actively involved in Indian wars his whole life, would ever actually say to an Indian in 1892. It did not belong there, and it was my first sign that, oh, don't go off the rails. And then there's this whole third act conflict that occurs that just is put in there for no other reason than we had to finally put black hats on some people and white hats on others. And they spoil it. They just spoil it. And I don't want to give details because I don't want to spoil this movie because I'm still actually going to recommend it. I would give this movie a B+. I'm going to give it a B+, and the only reason it's not an A+ is because of what they do in the third act. But I actually, the actual ending of the movie, the very, very end, was quite good, and I was satisfied with that. I just felt like they didn't stick one of their landings in a hop. There was a hop at the end of the floor routine, and it didn't need to be there, and it spoiled something that was on its way to being nearly perfect. It is a beautifully filmed movie. It's still a very good movie. I'm just disappointed in some third act decisions, but I do recommend the movie. And unfortunately, it will not end up in any of my lists of the greatest Westerns ever because of some third act failings. That is all the time we have for this show, but I remind you that you can listen to this and previous episodes on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Pocket Cast. We're on YouTube and thedailystir.com. Please take a moment to write a review in whatever app you're using to listen to this podcast. This is a labor of love, but we need to grow. Trump supporters, you are not alone. Goodbye, Doris.
Goodbye, Matt.